Juliana Blake had never believed in the idea of starting over. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had seen firsthand how the past had a way of following you, reshaping itself to fit even the cleanest corners of a new life. A seasoned physical therapist with over 2 decades of experience, Juliana had recently moved into a quiet, well-kept neighborhood just outside of the city. The rows of neatly trimmed hedges, pale stucco homes, and ornamental mailboxes gave off an air of stability that she had been craving after years of late nights, hospital alarms, and living in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fatigue. She wasn't chasing luxury, just distance from everything that used to feel chaotic. Her teenage daughter, Jane, was recovering from a rare neuromuscular condition that had left her partially immobilized for months. While her physical symptoms had lessened thanks to intense therapy, the emotional fallout was ongoing. Jane was withdrawn, hyper-aware of her surroundings, and only truly calm when accompanied by Tessa, her certified service dog, a chocolate Labrador trained not just in mobility support but also to interrupt panic responses and respond to medical episodes. Tessa had been more than a dog from the moment she arrived. She was a presence, a stabilizer, and to Juliana, the truest form of peace they'd managed to carve out in years. The neighborhood was supposedly ideal for families like theirs. No through traffic, quiet sidewalks, mostly older residents, and a few young couples sprinkled in. But almost immediately after moving in, Juliana sensed something unspoken running under the surface. Neighbors waved but didn't engage. A woman down the street gave disapproving looks when Tessa trotted beside Jane during morning walks, as if the dog's presence violated some unspoken code of appearances. Jane didn't complain, but Juliana noticed the tension in her daughter's shoulders, how she held her breath passing certain houses. She attributed it to nerves and trauma recovery, until Jane quietly mentioned one evening that some men in matching jackets had approached her after school, asking if she felt safe walking alone and offering to escort her home, on behalf of the community. Tessa growled at them and they left, but Jane had been rattled. Juliana's gut twisted. She hadn't received any notice about neighborhood patrols, and there was no mention of security presence in the orientation materials. She decided to ask around, assuming it might be an overzealous neighborhood watch or a misunderstanding. But nobody could or would explain who those men were. The incident, minor as it seemed at first, felt off in a way Juliana couldn't articulate. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she also knew one thing from experience. Anything that made her daughter feel unsafe was worth watching, and everything about this place had suddenly started to feel a little too controlled, a little too quiet. It happened on a Thursday afternoon that began like any other. Warm sunlight filtered through the windows, the steady rhythm of Juliana's clinic day giving her a sense of normalcy she had learned not to take for granted. She had just finished with her last patient and was sitting in her office writing up notes when her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something about the timing gave her pause. She answered, and the voice on the other end was calm, slightly breathless and unfamiliar. It belonged to an older man who introduced himself as Everett, a neighbor from 3 streets over. He said he had found her daughter sitting on the ground near the community lot, clutching her dog and shaking, barely able to speak. His tone wasn't panicked, more concerned, bordering on confused. He didn't know what had happened, only that something wasn't right and that Jane had asked for her mother before shutting down completely. Juliana didn't need any more details. She was already out the door, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her keys, adrenaline rising in her throat like smoke from a fire she couldn't see. By the time she reached the small parking area near the park, the sun was beginning to dip behind the houses, casting long, uneven shadows across the lawn. Jane was sitting on the ground, her back against a bench, Tessa pressed against her side like a sentinel. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her breathing shallow and rhythmic in that way Juliana recognized instantly as the aftershock of a panic episode. She thanked Everett with a quick nod and knelt in front of her daughter, brushing the hair gently from her face and asking nothing, just offering presence. Jane didn't speak at first. She just wrapped her arms around Tessa and clung to her like a life raft. After several minutes, they made their way back to the car in silence. That evening, after a warm bath and the quiet comfort of familiar routines, Jane finally opened up. She said it slowly, her voice brittle. 2 men had approached her again, wearing the same matching dark jackets with an insignia that didn't look official but gave the impression it was. They stopped her near the park entrance, saying they were community compliance officers. sent to escort her home because a complaint had been filed about her unstable behavior. One of them had a clipboard with a paper on it, but when she tried to see it, he tilted it away. Jane told them her mother was at work and she didn't need assistance, but they insisted, saying, "Children with conditions like yours often don't realize when they're in danger." When Tessa stood between them and Jane, growling, the men backed off, but not before one of them muttered something like, "This won't look good on your record." That phrase stuck with Juliana. What record? Who were these people and who gave them the right to approach her daughter alone and make her feel as though she were some kind of threat or liability? The next morning, Juliana called the local police department. She didn't want drama, only answers. If there were sanctioned patrols or community safety programs, she had a right to know. But the officer on the line confirmed they had no registered neighborhood patrols matching that description, and certainly no unit tasked with approaching minors alone. What's more, the insignia Jane described did not correspond to any official or contracted agency. They filed a report, took the details seriously, and promised to circulate a description internally in case anything came up. But that didn't soothe Juliana. Something about the interaction rang deliberate, not random. The way they had approached Jane with confidence, invoking authority that wasn't real, meant one thing. They believed they could get away with it. They weren't testing boundaries. They were executing something rehearsed, and someone in the area either knew about it or was quietly allowing it. Later that week, a sealed envelope appeared on Juliana's doorstep with no return address. Inside was a single printed sheet of paper titled Behavioral Observations, Minor Resident, with Jane's full name, date of birth, and even a cropped photo of her walking with Tessa. The language was clinical, cold, and frighteningly precise, as if written by someone mimicking a government report. It claimed Jane had shown signs of unpredictable emotional responses, interacted questionably with community infrastructure, and exhibited problematic reliance on an aggressive animal. The document stated that an incident review was pending, and that interventions may be recommended. Juliana's hands shook as she read it, not because of what it said, but because it implied someone had been watching them, documenting them, tracking them. Not as neighbors, not as concerned citizens, but as caseworkers or auditors assuming control they didn't have. This was no longer about some rogue residents playing pretend. It was strategic, veiled, and growing bolder. Juliana did what she had to do. She filed another report with the police, submitted the document for analysis, and began working with a legal advisor she trusted from her clinic's professional network. She also arranged for Jane to stay temporarily with her sister in a nearby town, not out of panic, but as a calculated measure. If this was escalating, then her daughter's safety could not depend on passive observation. Still, even in her most pragmatic state, Juliana couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, something slow-moving but deliberate, and that her daughter, and by extension herself, had been marked not by chance but by design. The quiet neighborhood no longer felt like a place to heal. It had begun to feel like a controlled environment, and she needed to figure out just who was doing the controlling before it went any further. Juliana didn't sleep that weekend, not in the true sense. She drifted in and out of restless half-sleep, waking at the sound of every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the window pane, her mind constantly calculating what steps to take next. With Jane temporarily staying at her sister's, the house felt cold and unnaturally still. The absence of her daughter, and even the quiet weight of Tessa's breathing at night, a void that kept Juliana on edge. She went through every legal document she'd signed upon moving into the neighborhood, searching for hidden clauses or references to any kind of oversight body that could explain what had happened. Nothing. The property disclosure forms, the welcome packet, the neighborhood association materials. None of them authorized the type of behavior that had been directed toward her daughter. The names listed on the board were unremarkable, the language sterile and standard. There was no mention of security officers, behavioral monitors, or compliance personnel. Still, the sealed envelope she had received with Jane's photo and detailed observation log suggested the involvement of something more than idle neighbor gossip. It felt administrative, institutional, but executed without oversight or accountability. On Monday, Juliana returned home after work to find a thin manila envelope wedged halfway into her mailbox, unmarked and sealed only by a strip of transparent tape. Inside were 3 glossy photographs, one of Jane walking down the sidewalk with Tessa, another of her bending to pick something up near the neighborhood garden, and a third, more chilling one, clearly taken through the blinds of Juliana's living room window, showing Jane seated on the couch, staring blankly at the television. No note, no context, just images, precise and intimate in their violation. Juliana's breath caught as she realized someone had been on her property, close enough to peer inside the house. The thought made her skin crawl. She immediately called the police and submitted the photos as evidence of stalking. The officer who arrived that evening was polite and methodical but careful in his phrasing. Without a clear threat or physical trespass that could be directly proven, the investigation would be limited in scope. Still, he documented everything, and Juliana insisted on filing an incident report, knowing full well that paper trails mattered. When she asked if the photos could be traced to a particular type of camera or lens, the officer offered to escalate it to the department's digital forensics team, but warned it might take time. She agreed. Every step mattered now, even if they were slow. Over the next few days, the neighborhood seemed to tilt further into quiet hostility. A woman who used to wave in the mornings now turned away when Juliana passed. Her garbage bin, always returned upright to the curb by sanitation workers, was suddenly found tipped over and half-emptied. On one occasion, someone carved a shallow line into the side of her car with a key. So deliberate it didn't look like vandalism, but a message. The cumulative effect wasn't loud, but it was invasive, designed to disorient and isolate her, to push her toward doubt or withdrawal. She didn't withdraw. Instead, she called her lawyer again and began the process of requesting all recorded meetings, minutes, and communications distributed by the neighborhood board over the past 12 months. Legally, she had the right to access them as a property owner. She wasn't expecting to find a smoking gun, but she needed patterns, timing, language, anything that could hint at how far back this scrutiny went and who initiated it. The request was met with hesitation and bureaucratic delays, but she documented every exchange and involved her legal counsel in every reply. Then came the most brazen escalation. On Thursday morning, Juliana was backing out of her driveway when she noticed a silver panel van parked directly across the street. There were no logos on its sides, no plates on the front, and its windows were dark. She slowed, watched. The engine was running, though no one was visible through the windshield. She circled the block and returned from the opposite direction 10 minutes later. The van was gone. That same evening, when she reviewed footage from the exterior cameras she had installed around the property, she found a gap, exactly 12 minutes of missing footage from one camera. Not corrupted, not glitched, missing. The file names jumped, timestamps intact, but the visual data simply wasn't there. She checked the other angles. One camera, mounted above the garage, captured the reflection of the silver van in her neighbor's car window as it pulled up. A man stepped out, walked up her driveway, and knelt by the side of the house, right where the wires ran to the camera junction box. Tessa, usually calm in the evenings, had barked frantically that night and refused to rest until Juliana led her inside the bedroom. At the time, she had thought the dog was reacting to an animal. Now she wasn't so sure. Juliana contacted the police again, this time with footage in hand. The responding officer was younger, more skeptical, and implied that there could be an innocent explanation. Juliana didn't argue. She knew how this worked. Law enforcement needed escalation. Clear evidence of threat, not implications. But she still pushed the report through, demanded it be attached to the ongoing file. She also escalated her legal case, pushing her attorney to draft a formal cease and desist addressed to any person or party responsible for unauthorized monitoring of a minor, including legal language referencing state laws regarding stalking, harassment, and use of surveillance on private property. It wasn't just about being proactive anymore. It was about drawing a line, publicly, legally, and without ambiguity. Then, late one night, her landline rang. No one had that number but family. She picked it up, and after a long pause, a voice, distorted as though run through a low-grade modulator, spoke 3 words. "The dog interferes." That was all. No click, no hang-up. The line remained open, humming faintly. Juliana froze. Her first instinct wasn't fear, it was anger. Cold, grounded, simmering anger. The voice wasn't meant to threaten. It was meant to confirm, to assert control, to suggest that Jane's protection, the very symbol of stability in their lives, was now a target. She hung up, unplugged the line, and sat for a long time in the dim kitchen light, Tessa at her feet, alert but calm. The first escalation was complete. They had stepped forward. The only question now was how far they were willing to go, and how ready she was to stop them. The turning point came not with a scream, not with shattered glass or sirens in the distance, but with something quieter, colder. Paper. Juliana had begun compiling every document, photo, voicemail, and physical observation into a chronological file that she shared in encrypted form with her attorney. She also reached out to a private legal investigator recommended through a secure network of medical professionals who had dealt with high-stakes patient protection cases. She didn't want speculation, she wanted patterns. The man she was connected to was direct, highly methodical, and most importantly, discreet. He didn't promise quick answers. Instead, he offered data. What he found, he sent without opinion. The first thing he uncovered was that 3 of the people listed as current members of the Neighborhood Association Board didn't match property records. 2 of them weren't even listed as residents within the development. One was tied to a development firm that had recently acquired several properties in nearby areas, quietly and at below-market rates. The third was linked through financial disclosures to a security subcontractor that had once serviced residential enclaves under short-term private compliance contracts. In other words, these weren't neighbors. They were placeholders, faces on a page used to justify policies no one had voted for. The second thing the investigator found hit even harder. A report had been filed weeks before Jane was first approached, listing her as a resident of concern due to her visibly disruptive assistance animal and unregulated emotional expression in shared zones. It was written in deliberately ambiguous legalese, the kind Juliana had seen before in bureaucratic hospital memos, meant to sidestep liability while still shifting blame. What disturbed her most was the attachment. A time-stamped image of Jane sitting quietly on a bench with Tessa at her feet. Not disruptive, not doing anything but existing. That image had been shared to an internal communication board used by a private compliance consulting agency based in a neighboring city. That company had no contract on file with the neighborhood, yet their watermark appeared on the photo. The implication was clear. Someone outside the community had already been involved before the first incident even occurred. This wasn't a response to something Jane had done. It was a campaign, preemptive and calculated, designed to destabilize and provoke. Juliana didn't break down. She had long since learned to compartmentalize pain into action. Instead, she asked her attorney to file a formal inquiry through the state's Administrative Oversight Board, naming the companies in question and requesting a regulatory review of their legal right to operate on or near residential zones without consent. She also had a secure camera system installed inside the house. Discreet, motion-triggered, feeding to a cloud system with multi-location access points. Every light fixture, every door sensor, every digital access point was logged and backed up. She wasn't being paranoid. She was being practical. The day after the cameras were installed, she received a visit from a man claiming to be a community infrastructure assessor. He wore a lanyard, carried a clipboard, and said he was there to evaluate front-facing compliance indicators. Juliana smiled, nodded, and asked him to wait while she retrieved a document. Instead, she locked the door, called the police, and recorded the man's image from her front window. By the time authorities arrived, he was gone. When she handed over the footage, the officer recognized the insignia on his badge. It belonged to a dissolved department that hadn't operated in over 5 years. That same evening, as she sat reviewing the compiled evidence with her legal team over a secure call, the front porch light flickered. Nothing unusual, except it was a brand new LED bulb installed less than 48 hours prior. When she checked the camera feed, she saw a shadow, brief but distinct, crossing the lens near the side gate, just beyond motion range. Tessa began pacing, low growls rumbling in her chest, her attention fixed on the kitchen door. Juliana reached for the pepper spray she now kept on the counter and moved toward the back hallway, heart pounding in steady rhythm. But nothing happened. No knock, no break-in, just silence, stretching longer than it should have. The next morning, she found the cover panel of the utility access box by the side yard ajar, the screws lying neatly beside it, not torn off, but unscrewed slowly and placed down with precision. The inside had not been damaged, but someone had been inside it. She took photos, reported it, and had the system checked by an independent electrician, who confirmed nothing was sabotaged. Yet, it felt like a warning or a rehearsal, and then came the letter. It was delivered not through the mailbox but slipped under the door during the early morning hours, folded twice with no envelope. It contained a single sentence printed in capital letters. Compliance is safety. No signature, no contact, just the phrase. The paper smelled faintly of industrial cleaning agent, the kind used in corporate offices or hospitals. Juliana stared at it for a long time before folding it again and placing it into her growing file. That was when she realized this wasn't just about Jane. It was about pressure, compliance, control, and consequences for those who resisted. This had ceased to be about misunderstanding or overreach. It was now strategic psychological manipulation. The middle point had arrived. The next step would not be slow. It would be deliberate. Juliana had to move faster, not just for her daughter, but because the rules she was playing by no longer applied to the people watching her. The escalation came with terrifying elegance. Not a burst of violence or chaos, but the kind of pressure that coils slowly around the chest, stealing breath incrementally until it becomes difficult to recognize where fear ends and strategy begins. It started with a notice posted not to Juliana's door, but to her digital property profile on the neighborhood's online management system. She received a cold, automated message notifying her that a compliance irregularity had been filed against her residence regarding unauthorized behavioral variance of a classified service animal. The term meant nothing in legal language. It wasn't codified, nor did it reference any state or federal documentation regarding service animals. But it had the sharp, vague tone of something serious, something a less informed resident might take as an official warning. Juliana, however, knew better. She printed it, flagged it to her lawyer, and requested that he formally address the use of unrecognized terminology within any official community communication. That same evening, a technician from a utilities company arrived, claiming there was a scheduled inspection of gas and water access points. Juliana hadn't received any notice. She asked for identification and logged the name he gave her, but something about his demeanor, a practiced calm, almost too neutral, made her uneasy. She refused entry, stating that all such access required written notice through verified municipal channels. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked away, but not before glancing once not at her, but at the side of the house where Jane's bedroom window faced the yard. That look was too pointed to be random. Juliana waited until he left, then checked the window's locking mechanism herself, tightening the bolts on the inside and installing a vibration sensor along the frame before calling the local utility office to report the visit. They confirmed that no inspections had been scheduled or authorized in her area. The following day, Jane returned home for the weekend. Juliana didn't tell her everything that had happened, only what was necessary to keep her alert without stoking panic. Jane was quiet, observant, but less withdrawn than before, and Tessa never left her side, even at night. On Saturday, as Juliana prepared breakfast, she saw Jane's face go rigid through the reflection in the kitchen window. Outside, across the street, the silver panel van had returned, parked at an angle just far enough to appear casual, yet clearly positioned with direct view of their front yard. Juliana called the non-emergency police line, reported the license plate, this time partially visible, and kept the call active while positioning one of the interior cameras to catch any interaction. As officers arrived, the van pulled away without resistance, and Juliana recorded every second. When the footage was reviewed later, it showed the driver wearing what appeared to be the same insignia seen on the previously reported infrastructure assessor, though altered, less defined, deliberately blurred, as though the design had been modified to skirt recognition. Later that afternoon, they found the first real threat. A cardboard box, plain and unmarked, was left on the back steps. It was light, not sealed, and contained 3 items: a used dog collar, a folded copy of the same compliance letter previously posted online, and a torn photograph, half of Jane's face and half of Tessa's, ripped clean through the middle. Juliana didn't speak. She simply picked up her phone and called her attorney, then the police, then the investigator. She provided fingerprints, the box, the contents, all handled with gloves, all preserved as evidence. The officers documented everything and promised to flag the residents for drive-by monitoring, but Juliana didn't rely on promises. That night, she initiated emergency motion detectors in the backyard, and programmed a silent alarm linked directly to her phone and the investigator's backup line. If anything moved past the perimeter, she would know, and so would someone who could respond faster than protocol allowed. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, just after 3 a.m., her phone vibrated. Not rang, but gave the low, urgent buzz of the private trigger alert she had coded. The backyard sensor had picked up motion, and within seconds, her cloud feed displayed 2 figures near the back fence. They moved methodically, wearing dark clothing, no reflective elements, gloves, and masks. Not ski masks, but fitted coverings meant to obscure facial features without drawing suspicion. One carried what looked like a tool bag, the other a tablet device with a dim screen. Tessa, already alert, rose from her position beside Jane's bed and began a slow, deliberate growl. Juliana rose without sound, grabbed her phone, and activated the secondary lockdown switch, a remote signal that quietly locked all windows and doors from the inside, then dimmed exterior lights to conceal visibility without disabling the cameras. The 2 intruders didn't attempt entry. Instead, they walked the perimeter slowly, stopped near the utility box, opened it with a key, and inserted a device the size of a mobile battery pack before retreating without urgency. By morning, the device was gone, but the box showed subtle signs of tampering. Scratches near the latch, dirt disturbed on the surrounding grass. Juliana submitted a full report, and this time her attorney initiated a direct inquiry with the state regulatory board, citing physical evidence of unauthorized surveillance and property interference. That same day, Jane received a text message from an unknown number. It contained a blurry image of Tessa lying at her feet during a school reading session. The message read, "Service isn't protection." Jane showed it to her mother without a word. Juliana didn't hesitate. She contacted a private protective consultant and requested a short-term tactical audit of her property. Not just cameras and locks, but full-spectrum vulnerability mapping. It wasn't paranoia, it was strategy. This wasn't just about being watched anymore, it was about being tested. They weren't trying to scare her. They were trying to make her choose between submission or escalation. The audit revealed subtle, deliberate weaknesses in her exterior layout. Dead zones between camera ranges, blind angles near the neighbor's hedges, a vulnerability in the attic window that could be accessed with a simple extendable ladder. Juliana had them all corrected. By the end of the week, her home was no longer just secure. It was a controlled environment, not a trap, a line in the sand, and just in time. Because as her investigator reported in his next update, 3 other homes in the development had recently changed ownership under suspicious conditions. Residents who had no history of moving suddenly vacated, leaving no public record of sale. Their properties had already been listed under a new shell management group. One of them had been directly across the street. The silver van, it turned out, had once belonged to that household. What Juliana realized then chilled her more than the late-night intrusions or threats. These weren't random attacks. They were part of a pattern, an invisible hand, pressing families until they left or complied. And someone had decided that her refusal made her a target, not just of surveillance, but of removal. The second escalation wasn't just harassment. It was an attempt at displacement. And Juliana knew if she didn't hold her ground, she would disappear next. The culmination came not with noise or sudden violence, but with a sense of sharpened inevitability, as though everything that had been building, quiet surveillance, manipulated intimidation, the calculated dismantling of boundaries, was finally coalescing into one deliberate act. In the days leading up to it, the pressure shifted from psychological to procedural. There were no more anonymous notes, no more vans parked across the street. Instead, a new form of intrusion emerged: paperwork. Official-looking but untraceable forms were posted to the digital portal used by residents of the neighborhood, indicating that Juliana's property had been flagged for a mandatory visual assessment to verify service animal compliance and behavioral conditioning records. The language was dense, dressed in legal formality, yet entirely fictional. No state or federal agency issued such assessments, and the so-called regulatory body listed in the footer didn't exist in any recognized directory. But it gave the illusion of legitimacy, and illusion, as Juliana had come to understand, was the primary weapon used by those pressing in from the shadows. By then, Juliana had already connected with her private legal investigator and data analyst, and her system of evidence collection was exhaustive. Every camera angle, every audio snippet, every time-stamped delivery and altered file was cataloged and mirrored in cloud storage she kept encrypted across 3 separate platforms. Her lawyer had already drafted formal cease and desist orders and had begun preparing an injunction to file against any unauthorized entities attempting to monitor, assess, or approach her daughter. But it was still paperwork, and the people watching her had long moved past the stage of waiting for permission. That week, Jane had returned home for a brief visit. Juliana knew the risk, but Jane insisted. She didn't want to feel exiled from her own home. Tessa had become more alert than ever, responding to sounds before they happened, shifting positions through the house at night with uncanny anticipation. Juliana trusted the dog more than any human system. It was Tessa who signaled that something was wrong. Not by barking or growling, but by refusing to sleep, circling the front and back doors, posture rigid, ears back, body ready. Juliana watched her closely and began to notice the patterns. Small environmental changes. A humming in the basement where there was no active equipment. A faint flicker in one of the external motion lights even after being replaced. Unseen hands testing limits in a way that left no fingerprints. Then came the presence. Not footsteps, not sound, but movement. 3 individuals stepping with absolute precision across the rear edge of her yard. Not dressed like intruders, but in a manner that signaled false authority. Dark, polished uniforms, tags clipped to collars, carrying nothing but a slim portfolio and what looked like scanning equipment. They moved as if they had the right to be there. One of them walked the perimeter while another approached the utility box, lifting the cover without hesitation, and placing a small rectangular device inside before closing it neatly, not in a rush. The third moved to the side of the house, standing just beneath Jane's bedroom window, staring not at the structure but at the glass, as if gauging the threshold between being seen and being allowed. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. It was not an attempt at entry. It was a demonstration, a show of dominance. They had studied her routines. They had timed the shift in her camera sweeps. They knew exactly how long they had. Juliana activated the internal security lock, then contacted both her attorney and the police through her priority emergency channels. Within minutes, backup was on its way, but that wasn't what she relied on. She stepped into the hall, Tessa at her heel, and watched through the reinforced glass as one of the figures placed a slip of paper against the door. No envelope, no tape. Just pressed there by hand and left behind. Then they turned and left as calmly as they had arrived, walking not toward the street but toward the narrow pathway that ran along the edge of the neighboring property. When the police arrived, they were gone, vanished into the early hours as if they had never been there. Juliana retrieved the paper without touching the side they had pressed. It bore a single line. Failure to comply is escalation. No letterhead, no agency. Just a statement, meant not as a warning, but as a declaration. When the responding officers reviewed the footage, they found it bizarre but inconclusive. No property damage, no direct threat, no evidence of criminal entry. But Juliana knew. She knew this wasn't about damage, it was about control, eroding sense of safety by degrees. That night, as she sat with Jane and Tess in the living room, every light off, every lock secured, she understood that what had just occurred wasn't an incident. It was a formal message. The final pretense stripped away. She was being told that their patience had run out. The next move would not come with silence or symbols. It would be physical, and it would not be vague. Juliana didn't panic. She wrote a new letter, this one addressed to her attorney, her investigator, and the state board. She included every recent event, attached photographic evidence, and referenced multiple violations of legal boundaries, state protection statutes for minors, and federal ADA protections. She requested an emergency injunction to protect Jane, to protect the dog, and to restrict any unverified entities from entering or approaching within 100 feet of her property. The foundation had been laid. What happened that night made everything visible. It showed their methods, exposed their posture. The illusion of oversight had crumbled. She had seen them, documented them, and now they had crossed into territory where the law could finally reach them. The culmination was not an attack. It was an unveiling, and it had made one thing clear. The time for being watched was over. Now they were going to be the ones under scrutiny. The days that followed moved with a clarity Juliana hadn't felt in weeks. The emergency injunction was filed, notarized, and fast-tracked by a judge who, after reviewing the compiled evidence, granted immediate restrictions against all unnamed security entities, compliance firms, and affiliated personnel within a set perimeter of her home. Police patrols were assigned without debate, and a formal investigation into unlicensed private enforcement operations in the region was opened through the district attorney's office. What had once been dismissed as vague or speculative had, under the weight of cumulative precision, become impossible to ignore. Her home was no longer the center of isolation. It became the center of attention, scrutiny shifting from her to those who had hidden behind forged badges and fake regulations. Jane stayed with her now, full-time, sleeping better than she had in months, never once asking to leave. Tessa, ever vigilant, softened too, sleeping more deeply, years less taut, as if the energy in the house had finally shifted. And it had. Juliana didn't celebrate. There was no dramatic closure, no knock on the door with final news. Instead, silence returned. This time not as a threat, but as space reclaimed. The online notices vanished. The strange surveillance activity stopped. Even the neighbors began to nod again, unsure of what had happened, but clearly aware that something had. Properties that had changed hands quickly now sat vacant, the paper trail of their transactions flagged and investigated. Whatever apparatus had been operating behind the curtain had retreated, not out of fear, but because exposure had rendered it ineffective. Control only worked in the dark. Juliana had pulled it into daylight. She didn't return to normal. She built something new, steadier, surrounded by people who had watched her resist and now quietly offered solidarity. Not through words, but through presence. One evening after a quiet dinner, she stepped onto the porch, Jane beside her, Tessa lying peacefully at their feet, and pinned a hand-painted sign to the gate that read simply, "We do not comply, we live." She didn't need them to see it. She needed to say it, and that was enough.